morning, Dog Nation. I am Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Kroger. You know, yesterday we talked a lot about the Georgia offense, some of the stuff that's out there about Gunnar Stockton, the role that some newcomers may play in kind of giving a boost to that Georgia offense. Today we're going to give a similar level of treatment to the Georgia defense and why outside the boundaries here, our little bubble of Dog Nation, there's a good bit of optimism about what Georgia might be able to be here in 2025. And we'll talk about why we think that's a fairly realistic appraisal overall, even if we're not quite as willing to echo some of the more kind of bullish statements. I'll explain all this here coming up in just a moment. Also, major weekend for Georgia recruiting. I want to say it's like 18 guys taking an official visit. More than a dozen of them, at least, I think, are like four-star type names. So this is big-time stuff. A couple of them are even brothers of Georgia players who are already on the roster. So that is fun. There's one big five-star name in particular to mention here. And we got plenty of other stuff going on, too, including an SEC coach who, kind of surprisingly, I would say, got some pretty big talk here right now. We'll have a little bit of a chuckle at that before we are done today. So it's a Friday. We're ready for a summer weekend. We're going to try to get it started for you on a good note, so we're glad to have you with us for it. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Kroger, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Kroger, fresh for everyone.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
On the desk here right now, and I feel like, I don't know, kind of old school or something, just got stuff just spread everywhere. First of all, I'm not a very organized person. Anyone who's ever worked with me knows that. You probably can even tell that a little bit just from kind of peering into our world on a regular basis. So I always have, stuff spread out on the desk. Today, more so than ever. The magazines are going to come back today, which I'm really excited about. We're going to do a little something on the magazines as it relates to Georgia. In fact, we're going to do the inverse a little bit of what we did yesterday. We talked a lot about the Georgia offense, some of what's being said about Gunnar Stockton, our reason for believing that some of the whole Stockton thing is sort of overplayed by kind of a sort of a low information brand of fan and the media that sort of serves the low information, kind of conversation that we actually feel like the Georgia offense actually probably set up better around a first-time starting quarterback than it has at times gotten credit for. We're going to do a flip side today. We're going to talk about the Georgia defense here for a moment. And it is interesting, at least in the couple of clips I'm going to play for you today by pretty prominent voices, that if we're kind of comfortable, we did the whole thing yesterday about, hey, is it time to sort of re-rack the Nolan Smith 7-5 and 25? Is there enough negativity out there about Georgia? Are there enough skeptics out there about Georgia that we could use that as kind of a soft target, sort of an easy enemy to sort of set us up for the upcoming season, with Georgia getting a chance to go out there and prove its critics wrong? Georgia fans kind of like that, and we've kind of talked about how much of that is realistic for this upcoming season. We joked about that some yesterday. But admittedly, on the flip side of the situation for Georgia, looking at the defense, at least in terms of a couple of prominent voices that I've recently heard, you don't have quite as much negativity. And I do think this is meaningful for Georgia here this season. Later on today, we're going to play an SEC network analyst kind of focusing in on one Georgia player in particular who I don't think that's getting a ton of chatter from Georgia fans, who he thinks just might be outstanding. We're going to give you that here in just a little bit. But let me start with a guy, and I've told you before, I think that Greg McElroy is kind of quickly becoming maybe the top analyst in the sport. I can't quite tell if Kirk Herbstreit has his eye on the ball anymore, how much of this he really wants to do. Obviously, ESPN's College Game Days had huge changeover last couple of years. Herbstreit's spread pretty thin, doing NFL games on Amazon Thursday night, things like that. I don't really know what Herbstreit wants his future to be. He's still a young guy. I'm not really quite so sure what he wants to be in the future. It doesn't seem like he's as immersed in college football as he once was. Sort of floats in the fall to talk about the games, but doesn't really live in these streets for 52 weeks out of the year. Well, a guy like Greg McElroy, I think pretty clearly does that, does a podcast, does a radio show, in the weeds when it comes to college football. And while McElroy's an Alabama guy, and frankly, not everybody around Tuscaloosa necessarily loves McElroy because he hasn't always been effusive in his praise of the Crimson Tide as much as they would like for him to be. The point is I do think, despite the fact he's kind of a Bama dude, by his nature, I think that McElroy's pretty quickly becoming, one of the bigger names, maybe on his way to being the biggest name when it comes to being kind of the college football analyst on TV. And on his show recently, it's called Always College Football. It airs on the ESPN, podcast channels and the ESPN YouTube page, much like we do around here. He was ranking his top 10 defenses for 2025. And perhaps somewhat surprisingly, because people kind of live in a world where history began last year, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, McElroy had Georgia as his number 4 overall defense in 2025. Now, I'm about to play a clip where he kind of talks about why he thinks that's an appropriate ranking. But here's the thing that you're also going to hear. You're also going to hear him anticipating some criticism and pushing back kind of preemptively against the criticism for having Georgia at number 4, which is a very, very interesting statement about the current landscape of the sport, that somehow ranking Georgia among your best defenses in college football, somehow that is now controversial. This is interesting. It's from Greg McElroy. It's earlier this week. His podcast, Always College Football. Take a listen to this.
At number 4, I'm going with the Georgia Bulldogs. And this might be a little controversial because they were not quite the same last year as they were in years past. There were moments for Georgia's defense last year where you're like, goodness gracious alive. I think about that first Texas game and just how crazy it was and how dominant they were and how aggressive they were. But then there were also moments like the first half against Alabama where it's like, what the heck just happened? So this was a group that was a little bit up and down last year, but I do think their low points, that floor should be quite a bit higher last year, partly because I just trust Kirby Smart. I think he's one of the best defensive minds in the entire country. I think he creates a culture of physicality and toughness that a lot of people don't want to play against, and it's hard to play against this group collectively.
So once again, McElroy lays it out, and I would say fairly easy to understand terms of why he believes Georgia can be among the elite units. Now, if you want to get the full breakdown, you should go to, the ESPN College Football page on YouTube, or just the Always College Football, thing on the podcast. Maybe we can put a link to that when we post the show later on, because he starts breaking down the various names and the positions, gives Justin Williams some praise, a lot of praise for Christian Miller in particular, talks about Jordan Hall coming back from injury. So he gets into the more specific details about the specific players and why he thinks they will help rise Georgia. This is not just sort of like flowery, non-specific, just sort of vagary. In the actual show itself, he goes into more detail, kind of position by position. We don't have time to play that, and most of what he talks about is ground we've already covered anyway. I was more interested in just sort of the overarching opinion of, hey, some of y'all are going to think this is controversial, but I think that Georgia is going to be one of the best defenses in America because I still trust Kirby Smart. So let's examine for a minute why McElroy would even feel the need to say this might be controversial. And to do so, let's go back to our magazines here for a moment. In fact, let me go Athlon first here for a moment on newsstands right now. The Athlon Sports College Football Preview magazine. By the way, you may see this show up in our Golden Shoe a little bit later on. Yesterday, and the thing that we obviously love the most about the preview magazines, no disrespect to the writers who put their name next to their content, we love the anonymous coaches. Something about it just sort of feels mysterious. This is a coach that competes against Georgia. We're told it's an opposing SEC assistant coach. We love the idea that a busy coach who's trying to recruit and grind it out and find a game plan to beat Georgia somehow also has enough time to get on the phone with Athlon and basically spill the tea, if you want to use a more modern phrase, about what he thinks about all these college football teams. Something about that I just find to be really fun. We talked about the offensive stuff in the magazine yesterday. Let me read what the opposing SEC coach says defensively here, and you'll see photographic evidence this does exist. He says defensively it's still an elite group, but they're thin at linebacker. We're hoping he means outside linebacker because obviously inside linebacker is maybe the single deepest position group anywhere in America. He goes on to say, and this is maybe why McElroy feels the need to equivocate when he praises the Georgia defense. He says, I don't think this is the same level of talent we've seen the last 3 to 4 years. He says, I think you might see a decline at first. He mentions both lines of scrimmage, but that's, of course, defense too. So, hey, still an elite group, but maybe a little bit of a dip in talent overall. Maybe that's the case. And obviously there are a bunch of sort of fans out there who sort of think the same kind of thing here because they remember what Georgia was a year ago, when Georgia was not the same it had been before. They're kind of outside the top 20 in scoring defense, or kind of right there at 20, outside the top 30 now for a couple of years in a row in rush defense, which sort of helps explain a lot of this, dipping down a little bit in kind of like the yards per play category where we'd sort of seen them before. That admittedly, just absolutely anybody with eyes can see this. If you can count, you recognize it. Georgia took a statistical dip a year ago. Now, how much of that's because of the Christian Miller injury or the Jordan Hall injury or the this or the that? I guess different people will have different opinions on that. But you can't dispute that Georgia did take a dip defensively. And so McElroy somewhat preemptively says to the people who are fixated on that, people who think that history began 12 months ago, that, okay, I know this may be controversial to you a little bit, but I actually think that Georgia is still one of the best defenses in America. We're going to come back to that in a minute. But let me also read to you what the Lindy's Magazine anonymous coach says about Georgia. And this is frankly far more positive overall. And this is, I think, a boost to the point that McElroy is making about, kind of what Georgia can be. The anonymous coach quoted by Lindy's in their scouting report says, Georgia still has those NFL-looking bodies getting off the bus, but the portal has balanced the playing field. We would say that's true. Damon Wilson, obviously, going to be playing for Missouri this year instead of Georgia. That's kind of an example of that. This coach says, it's been a while since you felt you can take a shot at Georgia and not get punched back in the face. He says, I've been there and done that as a coach. He says, but Kirby is still Kirby when it comes to pulling talent. We talked about the Zachariah Branch thing yesterday. Defensively, he also mentions this. He says, to me, defensive tackle Christian Miller is the biggest problem on defense. He's tough inside, he plugs holes, and he's got enough to kind of, enough bull in him to collapse the pocket. So we've heard it said before, hey, you got that dog in you? Well, this coach says that Christian Miller's got that bull in him, which is perhaps even better. I'm not quite so sure. But either way, you kind of hear a little bit of what people sort of feel like they've seen about Georgia. Roster's not as deep as it used to be. Transfer portal has taken away some of the depth. Georgia was a little bit vulnerable on the field a year ago. Statistics sort of prove that out. And yet the anonymous coach says, quoted by Lindy's Magazine, still look good getting off the bus. Christian Miller, still among the very best defensive linemen, maybe in the entire sport. By the way, it's worth pointing out in the longer clip of McElroy talking about Georgia in his podcast, he also mentioned Christian Miller by name. That's sort of where we are. So let me kind of pontificate on this just for a couple of minutes, and then we're going to get into the more deeply into this a little bit after that. There is a phrase that we sometimes use in baseball. Every now and then on our R.S. Andrews Cool Down, which is our commentary where I read comments at the end of the show, we'll end up talking about baseball, especially right now because Georgia's baseball season just concluded. We've been talking about baseball in there a little bit. So I love baseball. We were talking the other day about baseball cards. I grew up loving baseball cards. Love them. Well, there's a phrase we sometimes use in baseball. When a guy who we think of as a good player is struggling, sometimes the struggles will be excused or dismissed or disregarded. And the phrase, especially like old-time baseball guys will use is, just look at the back of the baseball card, and that tells you everything you need to know. In other words, he may be struggling right now, but if you flip the baseball card over, front of the baseball card's got the picture, it's got the border. If you flip the baseball card over, it's got year by year all of the stats this player has produced during his baseball career. And if that year by year stat line looks really good, then momentary struggles are probably meaningless. Momentary struggles are probably a blip on the radar. For whatever reason they might be happening, they're probably a blip on the radar. The back of the baseball card tells me that so-and-so's probably going to figure it out and going to probably be very good. So let's use that analogy for a moment to talk here about the Georgia defense. What you saw from the Georgia defense a year ago was real. Now, I'll tell you, I think they were better last year defensively than they were in 2023, even though not every stat kind of necessarily points that out. But what we saw from the Georgia defense a year ago was real. They, at times, had trouble stopping the run. They, at times, were given fits by running quarterbacks, athletic running backs who could find the outside edge. At times, Georgia had some real issues with that. That was real. And so, therefore, that led to more converted drives, more points scored. Think about the shootout against Tech, or like the blowout loss to Ole Miss, or the crazy game against Alabama. Those were not very Georgia-like moments. We dealt with some of those in 2024. And people who have very short memories, sort of low capacity for information, they'll now say, okay, what I just saw is the only thing that exists. Therefore, Georgia's not good defensively. And for a guy like Greg McElroy to say this is among the nation's best, it is somehow to sort of use his thing controversial to say that. But this is where we would kind of say to the football fans, the football community, analysts, fan, media, all alike, look at the back of the baseball card here for a moment. Or if you prefer, look at the back of the football card. Georgia was not a great defensive team last season, by its own standards, certainly. Does that represent a sea change? Transfer portals caught up to you. NIL age, you can't pay everybody. Now everybody's paying players. The Big Ten people will tell you. And so all of a sudden now they've leveled the playing field because of that. People have their ready-made narratives for why things are the way they are. Maybe they have changed. I would say that generally speaking in college football, things don't actually change all that quick. Things can change slowly over time. We've seen that with Georgia. From the time Kirby Smart was hired, 2016, all the way to 2021, Georgia built itself into a national championship program. It didn't happen dramatically overnight. It happened over the period of years. Oftentimes, regression would happen the same way. That maybe last year kind of shows you, Georgia's no longer an elite defense. But typically speaking, those kinds of dramatic changes don't happen instantaneously. They sort of happen over a period of years. Decline is typically somewhat slow. So we're a little skeptical that somehow last year represents a new normal for Georgia, and now it no longer has an elite defense to count on. It wasn't elite last year, but we would say the back of the football card suggests in two national championship seasons in 2021 and 2022, and frankly the previous era for Kirby Smart, even prior to that Georgia usually can count on a top 10 defense, top 10 in points allowed, top 10 in yards per play, passing, rushing, all things being, considered. Georgia is just usually, previously, kind of a rubber stamp to be a top 10 defense, even in the non-national championship seasons. So when someone like Greg McElroy says, I think this is going to be one of the best defenses in America, we would say history is on his side. Immediate history, not so much. Long-standing history, which is perhaps the more important set of data, clearly that's on his side. So let me conclude this topic by saying this. What if that's true? I mean, really, this is a summer Friday. We're hopefully all in a good mood. We're ready to begin, a fun weekend and just sort of enjoy ourselves here. We're kind of biding our time before the season begins. What if McElroy's right? I would say McElroy's a pretty smart football guy. What if he's right? What if Georgia is among the best defenses in America? Last year it wasn't. Now, it played that way against Texas in October, but it wasn't that way for 12 games. How much better would have Georgia been a year ago if it had the fourth best defense in America, which it probably wasn't last season? How much better would Georgia have been a year ago? All the drops, whatever's going on with Carson, injuries to running backs, all those issues. What if Georgia had the fourth best defense a year ago? Could that season have looked different? We would suggest it probably could have. So what if Georgia does have, as McElroy says they will, fourth best defense in America this year? Once again, all the stuff we talked about yesterday, the panic peddling about Gunnar Stockton, his first-year starting quarterback, the need to upgrade wide receiver, the need to figure out why the offensive line didn't quite gel last year, the need to dramatically upgrade your running game. All of those are real issues, but how much easier is it to accomplish those issues if on the other side of the ball you've got the fourth best defense in America? It's kind of fun to consider, right? That, as we've been saying somewhat repeatedly, there is real need for improvement with Georgia to kind of accomplish its end of season goals. There are legitimate questions that need to be answered. But the actual path to achieve all of that improvement and to get better where Georgia needs to get better isn't as hard, I think, as some people have made it sound like it is. And if Georgia really does have a top-flight defense, an elite defense among the best in America, even if some people think that opinion's controversial because they didn't see Georgia do that a year ago, it's perhaps not as difficult to achieve as you might imagine, just given the fact that's mostly what Kirby Smart has produced in his time as the Georgia coach. So everything that we want to see Georgia do this year, boy, it all gets better, even if a guy like Greg McElroy is just a little bit right about what he's saying about the Georgia defense. My name is Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Kroger. We are glad you were with us. We are, by the way, not done with the Georgia defensive conversation here today. We're going to give you a different analyst in a moment, giving you even more praise about really kind of a specific Georgia player. This will be fun and interesting. We will do that with you here coming up in just a moment. Prior to that, though, we're glad to have Kroger with us here today and thankful for what Kroger does with us in the community here, too. Also, word of warning, this is for the ladies that are out there, or perhaps the young folks who are out there, young males and females alike. We're coming up very soon on Father's Day. And I tell you, I love Father's Day for no other reason than it's like the one day of the year I don't have any pressure to kind of get it right. It feels like a lot of these other holidays, I'm always kind of worried about what I'm going to get wrong. But as the dad, at least on Father's Day, I get to know the pressure exists on somebody else. So do right by your dad. He doesn't want much probably, but take good care of him. Our friends at honestly, he wants a good meal is what he wants. So our friends from Kroger can kind of help you get ready for all of that. From grilling to gifting, everything in between. You get those dad-worthy picks and selections right there at your local Kroger. So you're already shopping in store anyway. Next time you're there, go ahead and, believe it or not, you actually can plan ahead in life. And so go ahead and start thinking about the Father's Day stuff. Good cookout. Dads always seem to like that. You can also go online, Kroger.com for more on that today. Kroger.com for more on that today. We love our friends at Kroger. We're happy to have them as a part of our program. We also like our guy Jeff Sentell here too. And we're going to speak to Jeff here coming up in a few minutes. And boy, oh boy, will it be a juicy conversation because Georgia got a big commit this week. We'll talk more about Justice Fitzpatrick. But man, oh man, there are so many big visitors coming in for Georgia this weekend. Really, really long list when it comes to who's going to be in Athens. We'll spend a lot of time talking to Jeff about all of that. Prior to that, though, let's get ready to go around the doghouse. It's presented today by our friends at Zagoria Law. So, as I said, we're a little bit of a theme show today. We're looking at the Georgia defense. And you just heard one of the anonymous coaches say this in the magazine we read a moment ago. Georgia's been hurt by the transfer portal. Talent-rich team like Georgia, they've been hurt by the transfer portal. And admittedly, we've seen talented players leave the Georgia program. Damon Wilson, an example of that for this year. But it is fair to point out that while Georgia is vulnerable to some of its depth leaving the program, going somewhere else, we've seen that happen. Georgia also gets to use the transfer portal as well. And we are seeing some evidence here that Georgia might be, judiciously, of course, they're not, filling their roster with transfers because you kind of turn into a barnstorming, pickup team if you do that. But judiciously, we've seen Georgia perhaps use this transfer portal really well this offseason. Talked a lot about Zachariah Branch yesterday as a for instance on that. We could have mentioned Doan Thomas. We could have mentioned others. On the defensive side of the ball, there's also attention being paid to Georgia's recent ad in the spring transfer portal, Elo Modozie, the edge rusher from Army. Modozie's an interesting story because, like a lot of guys, how do you fly under the radar? How do you go unnoticed? Well, kind of coming, I guess, out of high school around sort of a COVID-type time when, scouting was just deficient. People either weren't playing or you weren't getting out and seeing as much. A lot of weird things happen around the pandemic. That's why we would say on the field, everybody knows anything that happened on the field during the pandemic, of course, doesn't count. Florida winning the East, Alabama winning the national title, those things are essentially erased from memory and should be erased in the record books because what happens in a pandemic clearly doesn't count. But nonetheless, for a guy like Modozie, if he's such a big deal, how come he only ended up at West Point to begin with? Some of that was just, as a lot of guys were, just sort of overlooked during that period of time. But with the transfer from Army to Georgia, there are a growing number of voices who think Elo Modozie, this could be his moment. Let me start with CBS Sports, who recently chronicled the top transfers in the SEC set for instant impact, and Elo Modozie was one of the names. This wasn't a each school gets their one. This was like a handful of transfers. Some schools had more than one. Georgia had this one. Elo Modozie getting credit here. CBS writer saying Modozie had his pick of the litter at the conclusion of spring practice as one of the top edge rushers available. The star of Army's defense last season with 6.5 sacks. He should have more opportunity to pick his spots with the Bulldogs as a situational threat off the edge. There was not a preseason heavyweight from the SEC in need of more help on the front seven than Georgia coming out of April, and the addition of Modozie checked all the necessary boxes. So a moment ago when we were talking about the Georgia defense, I kind of said, hey, let your mind wander for a moment. Greg McElroy says this will be one of the best defenses in America. Let's assume for a moment that McElroy might be right about that. We said that. In this particular case, when I see CBS kind of chronicling Modozie as one of the top transfers in the SEC, maybe that might be true. I don't have any reason to suspect that it's not. But once again, to kind of go by the track record here, I think that Georgia will do well if Modozie steps in, and instead of being one of the top transfers in the SEC, if he's honestly just a typical Georgia outside linebacker, that might be okay. And it's fair to point out, for as dominant as Georgia is in a lot of areas, for whatever reason, they haven't kind of like fully unlocked the potential of the edge rushing outside linebacker yet. Like the guy from that position who became a first-round pick, ironically enough, Nolan Smith, was actually injured for most of the year in which he became a first-round pick. You know, Georgia has just been great at defensive line, great at inside linebacker, no shortage of guys from the secondary, be it corners or safeties. Edge rushing outside linebacker has just sort of been more of a solid starter's position, more so than the household name position. Maybe eventually that changes. It'd be nice if it did. But my guess is Modozie is not coming to Georgia to become the most famous pass rusher in college football. My guess is, and I hope this is true, my guess is he's coming to Georgia to fill the need based on the previous standard for the position. That's actually what I'm hoping ends up being true, which means a lot of people kind of outside the bubble of DawgNation may not know who Modozie is, if that's indeed the case. That is my honest assessment, not because I've, crunched film or anything like that. It's just because I'm using history as my guide, as I try to do. However, while my honest and genuine feelings are a somewhat sort of tempered set of expectations for Modozie here at Georgia, it is interesting that someone who I will fully acknowledge knows more about football than I do, Cole Kubelik, the SEC network analyst, on his own podcast, was recently, we're in list season, we like lists. I guess he's ranking I don't even know what he's doing, top edge rushers or top whatevers. Maybe he's doing his own top defense, so maybe that's what it was. Either way, I saw this online, became really just profusely praising of Elo Modozie. CBS says this may be one of the top transfers in the SEC. Cole Kubelik, who knows this kind of thing, thinks that Elo Modozie might be even better than that. This at least is fun to sort of take around the block for a minute. Cole Kubelik really heaping some compliments and praise in the direction of the recent Army transfer here to Georgia, Elo Modozie. Take a listen to this.
You go get Elo Modozie, who we talked about in our impact transfer list a couple of weeks ago, I think has the ability, if he can add 8 to 12 pounds before he enters the season, he can be as dominant of an edge defender as there is in this league. And trust me, we're about to get to some real edge guys in the next two groups. He has that kind of twitch, that kind of motor, that kind of ability, that kind of just get off and want to. As anybody I've seen in the nation, that kid's got it. And you're going to add him to a group that already has a Gabe Harris, who is like Ram Man on the show He-Man, who just walks around literally trying to knock people over with the top of his head. Like it feels like his helmet's made of concrete when you watch him play football. I love the kid. He's sitting there playing a 3 technique, and the guy came in as an outside linebacker. How can you not love a kid that like goes in there and just wants to play football and wants to punish people every time he gets on the field? I'll take that every day.
So once again, Kublik is a football expert, especially when it comes to SEC football. So when he's heaping praise on Elo Modozie, it clearly means something. My instinct, though, is the other name that he mentions. If Georgia gets like a really big season from somebody on the edge, I'm always going to put my bet on a guy who's been here. And listen, it's not to disrespect Elo Modozie. I mean, it's amazing how much positive PR Georgia has gotten by adding Modozie, a guy who during the season, and Army was pretty good this year, like during the season, I mean, nobody was talking about at all, but suddenly, you look at the various national websites, their transfer rankings list and things like that. Modozie, Georgia's gotten a lot of positive PR for adding Modozie. Cole kind of takes it to the next level of saying, hey, this guy adds a little bit of weight, which Georgia people seem to be able to do because of a really outstanding nutrition and strength program. He could be the best pass rusher in the SEC. Feels a little bit much for me, but hey, maybe Cole knows more than I do. As I said before, if we think about like the Georgia roster as sort of a roulette wheel, and you're kind of putting your chips down on a number, I think I'd probably put my chip down on Gabe Harris. I think, but I am never going to be, unentertained by someone kind of throwing some praise like that at a Georgia newcomer. So no matter what the actual makeup of the Georgia defense ends up being, just know this. As we get closer and closer to the start of the season, there are a lot of people who think this Georgia defense might actually be not just pretty good, might be really good, and kind of return to form after a little bit of a dip last year, among the nation's best. And everything that we all want Georgia to accomplish gets a whole lot easier if that turns out to be true. And that is Around the Doghouse, presented today by our friends at Zagoria Law. Now, I love talking about Georgia defense and the old school junkyard dog defense. We love that. Let the big dog eat. We're always about all of that kind of stuff right here. Any kind of old Georgia nomenclature. We're gonna gravitate towards that. But when it comes to actual dogs in your life or in your neighborhood or in your local park or wherever else, we don't want those dogs biting, and we certainly don't want them biting you. Or these big dogs that kind of get loose. I'm always amazed that like people just don't like. Yeah, there's all kinds of negligence that comes when you think about taking care of a dog. Dog gets loose, knocks you down, maybe it breaks your arm. You have your medical bills because of that, or the trauma associated with a dog bite. That's a thing. We see news reports about this sort of thing all the time. And in a situation like this, we would believe that you deserve representation and a chance for compensation, just like any other personal injury situation. And now statewide, that's what our friends at Zagoria Law live to serve you on. You can give them a call, 833-GA-DOG-BITE, dog spelled conventionally, D-O-G, 833-GA-DOG-BITE, or online, ZagoriaLaw.com, Z-A-G-O-R-I-A, ZagoriaLaw.com. Wherever you are in the state, our friends at Zagoria Law want to represent you. They literally wrote the book on how to win these type of cases. It's a very specific aspect of personal injury law. We like expertise when it's kind of narrowly focused because, honestly, those are the people who are kind of really in it deeply, and they know nuances and aspects of the law that people who are just kind of a little bit more of a fly-by-night operation, they might not know. So these are folks who have kind of heard the stories, they know the situation, and they feel like it's an area of service they can provide. So if you've been injured by a dog that got loose, you've been bitten by a dog, and you feel like there was some negligence involved, owner just not doing right, and you've got pain and suffering, medical bills, things like that, well, like any other personal injury situation, our friends at Zagoria Law want to help you because they wrote the book on how to win these type of cases. They're the only law firm in Georgia specializing in dog bite, dog injury situations, and they do that for you all across the state. So one more time, 833-GA-DOG-BITE, that's D-O-G, 833-GA-DOG-BITE, that's how you can call them, or online, ZagoriaLaw.com. All right, before we're done, a couple of things. An SEC coach, kind of a surprising name here, has been a little outspoken in a way that you may not necessarily expect. Plus, a warning for all of us as we get ready to make our college football predictions for the upcoming year. We'll give you that before we're done. But for now, a lot going on with Georgia recruiting. Let's get ready to cover it all. Busy weekend of official visitors, reacting to a big Georgia commit, and more. It's Jeff Sentell here right now on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Let us say hello to Jeff Sentell here. Always great to have him on a Friday, especially like this, when there's so much happening at Georgia. Jeff, we'll get to the commitments that Georgia's gotten here in a little bit. Let's kind of look ahead right now, though. Official visits on tap. Long list of names. I would say the biggest of the names, the headliner here, probably the 5-star running back Savion Hyder, who has indicated on social media that he will be at Georgia here this weekend. Hyder's obviously been a name of note, traveling around all over the place. How real is this for Georgia and Hyder? We've talked about other running backs here too, but how much of an actual opportunity does Georgia really have to make the impression on Hyder that could result in him joining this 2026 class? Is this the kind of thing that Georgia fans ought to spend time getting excited about?
Brandon, good morning, man. I guess they should. Let's have some fun, Brandon. We don't often get to do this, man. Did you see the tweet? I'm sure you saw the tweet, right? About what Savion Hyder said to a report that he was favoring Michigan and Tennessee. Did you see that one?
That he had not been giving anybody an interview, so I don't know. How he did say, "Listen, I don't know how anybody could know this, considering the fact I've done no interviews," which I did think was funny.
Yeah. So most people think, and there are two schools of thought. First of all, Brandon, Hyder is good enough that I think he would have been the number one running back in the country last year. I think he's good enough to get carries if he was at Georgia right now. Special running back. For those that, I'll use one of your vernaculars or euphemisms you were talking about a minute ago. For those that bleed red and black, Brandon, I know they love to have a stallion, a home run hitter in the backfield to wake up the notion of Georgia being RBU when it's kind of drifted away from that. I mean, they got Branson Robinson in 2022, Nate Frazier in 2024. But, Brandon, those are the only top 10 running backs Georgia has signed in the last 4 or 5 cycles now. So that's different. Of course, running backs cost a lot more money. Much of the online speculation, let's hit that one for everybody's bingo card. Most of the online chatter and speculation has Tennessee and Michigan ponying up with major dollars for Hyder. That's why they're the leader. Most dog fans I talk to or run across, Brandon, they say, okay, you didn't win the sweepstakes for Jackson Cantwell. You didn't win the bidding war, phenomenal number that's been thrown out now recently in reports from Mark Bowman. But if you didn't win the bidding war for those two, you got some chips left on your side of the table. Should you push all of them in there for Savion Hyder? That number may stretch up to $2 million per season for a back. Brendan, what do you think about that, man?
I mean, look, it's interesting in the NFL. We see the running back position now has additional value. The season by Saquon Barkley has brought running backs back into vogue again. I think we saw 3 taken in the first round of the NFL draft. We're also about to see more running backs get paid in the future, including, by the way, here in Atlanta as well. When it comes to Bijan Robinson, he could be in line the next year or so for a pretty significant increase to his salary. So a lot of things in football, like life in general, operate in cycles. And I would say that the running back position, I mean, a year ago, running backs were more important for Ohio State than quarterback was. The pair with Henderson and Judkins, in a Chip Kelly offense, that was probably more important for Ohio State than Will Howard at quarterback. Jeremiah Smith, of course, was their most important offensive player. But running back were really important for the last, national champion, and it was important for Michigan the year prior to that too. So, whatever the reason is, hey, you've got money left over, now you're going to spend it here. Whatever the narrative is that concludes it. I mean, I do think that we are currently in a moment where there is additional value to the running back position than perhaps existed for this position, maybe even as recently as a couple of years ago.
Got a cautionary tale, Brandon. One of those things I've been talking a lot to a lot of folks around the industry and just in college football in general about the numbers that are being thrown out. I'll reference Mark Bowman. The numbers that some USC sites are reporting is upwards of 8 to 10 million for 3 years, Brandon. That's quarterback money. So I want everybody to kind of think about some time travel for a little bit. And let's go back to, it's a concept of team building that really fascinates me, Brandon. Let's say Georgia was paying Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey major dollars for the 2023 season. Maybe Brock had a $2 million per year contract. Well, the way you have to build teams now, and it's almost like sort of like an economics model about sunk cost. like if you put all that money into a tight end, and listen, Brock Bowers was the most gamer tight end we've ever seen. And if he can't play, and that's a major investment for your offense. If he can't play, he can't go because football injuries happen. What does the rest of your team look like where you had to cut corners around a lot of areas because you spent so high for that player? I think what Georgia's doing right now with a lot of that, and I kind of trace this back to Savion Hyder. It's sure Georgia can hold up that paddle and Georgia can win. And rational folks like me and you can probably say, well, makes sense. Georgia has stacked linebackers. Georgia has stacked tight ends. Georgia hasn't really stacked running backs. And if you want to arm Jared Curtis with a lot of weapons, then this is a investment that makes a lot of sense, how you might have a future first-round draft pick at the running back spot again. But then what happens to the rest of your team when you overspend in a couple of areas? Like maybe that means you only get a top 30 offensive lineman instead of a couple of top 15 offensive linemen. So it's one of those things you feel like the way Kirby Smart is operating, when you spend in one area, other areas are going to be affected. And it looks like Georgia's got a set number for a lot of their positions, and they feel that's the best way for them to invest and build their team going forward.
Well, since you mentioned Bowman, I'll talk about it. I mean, I think the sense that I've gotten is that Georgia fans have had the proper reaction to this, which is, hey, Mark Bowman, I think, is kind of viewed consensusly as maybe the most sort of game-ready recruit in this 2026 class, the guy that you maybe feel more certain than almost anybody you could just kind of put out there and let him just play, and he's going to be able to achieve at the college level. He has, I would say, the highest floor maybe of anybody, just based on people who kind of know more about this than I do. And so therefore you really wanted him at Georgia, especially when he kind of reminds you a little bit of Brock Bowers. We never said next Brock Bowers, so thankfully we're marked safe from ever having made that comparison, I'm thankful to say. But you understand kind of where some of the comparisons come from. However, when you do hear, and I know there's been some, I guess, on the record reporting about this now, but the rumors were obviously, in existence over the course of the last few days. When you hear about these supposed millions upon millions of dollars, multi-year type deal that Bowman's alleged to have gotten, I haven't heard one Georgia fan say, Georgia, you should have paid it. You got to do this. I think that Georgia fans, in this particular situation, rightly understand that in the name of the game in sports, whether it's NIL in college or salary cap in the NFL or just budget in Major League Baseball, a non-salary cap league, overpaying is the unpardonable sin. When you overpay for talent, you are hamstrung for the future. And, we used to live in kind of an ego world of recruiting, where if you want the recruit, you do whatever it takes to get them because that's just kind of how you satisfy your ego. You can't have ego in recruiting anymore. You want a guy like Bowman. I would say, if USC doesn't do something ludicrous, my assumption is probably would have come to Georgia, I believe. I know Texas was a factor, but I believe he likely would have come to Georgia. But you can't let ego get in the way here. If USC wants to do something stupid to acquire him, honestly, you got to stand back and get out of the way and let them do it. Because for as much as I'd love to have had a guy like Bowman, doing something stupid to get him actually diminishes the team he'd play on when he gets here.
Yeah, sunk cost. It's one of those things, Brandon, when you look at Bowman, I think he'd be an instant starter. I think he would be a game changer at USC. Although we will have to remind folks, Brandon, I bet your mind goes back that far too. Remember Deuce Robinson, 5-star tight end, went to Lincoln Riley's offense, spent 1 year, and then had to transfer out to Florida State. And Brandon, Deuce had all these measurables as well. All these, hey, look at this guy, size, speed, even plays baseball, great athletic ability, great competitor. And he decided LSU wasn't the place for him after one season and transferred to Florida State. So again, he even made some plays, caught some touchdowns as well. So that's one thing to watch, Brandon. The other guy, you talk about the big spend. The only other guy that I think gets in that conversation of that, very high floor, could play right away. I think Atkinson, who's taking his official visit to Oregon this weekend, is another name that pops to mind there because I do believe, and I had this conversation with some folks this week, Brandon, I think when Kirby made that statement, all of his press conferences, we've been trained that Kirby's going to drop some pearls and some seeds that are not just for the beat core, all the game stories and all the daily buzz, but I think he tries to send a message. And I think when he talked about fire, passion, and energy, he said, give me that. I will pay a premium for that. I think he was talking about players exactly like Mark Bowman and Tyler Atkinson.
Yeah, perhaps that's the case. Let me go back to the visitors for this upcoming weekend. I think it's interesting that, by my count, there's at least a couple of siblings, brothers of current Georgia players expected to visit this weekend. P.J. Dean is the brother of Jared Wilson. I believe he's thought to be in Athens here this weekend. I'm always at risk of butchering this name. Kenny Agboko is also going to visit Georgia here this weekend. His brother, obviously, a Georgia defensive lineman. So there's a little bit, which is kind of ironic coming off the commitment of Carter Lucky last week. There's a little bit of a theme with like siblings of current Georgia players kind of in the mix here for these official visits. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, there's a few names that I would kind of highlight of this weekend. The first of those was Ekene Agboko, the younger brother of Nnamdi Agboko. And Brendan, to kind of continue that one little thread from what we are just talking about, Georgia feels that if you have to pay, maybe pay out the nose for a player, then they probably don't need to be at Georgia anyway. Like they want to find guys that want to come to Georgia for the development, the stage, and the work that it will take to develop. One of the things we wrote about this week, I thought Craig Dandridge had a really interesting take, as he said, when they're paying a lot and winning you and paying a lot of money for you, they're usually making up for other areas that they lack. Yeah. In Georgia, look at the program across the board. They're not lacking in a lot of areas. So maybe they've reached a point where they don't feel like they have to spend the highest bid. And if they do, it does take the highest bid to come to a place like Georgia, then Georgia's going to be a bumpy road for that recruit, because if the money made the decision, then the relationship's getting off a bad start to begin with. To bring it point full circle, Agboko, P.J. Dean, these young men know everything about the University of Georgia. They know the highs, the lows. They know how hard it is. They've got the inside VIP, behind the curtain, every aspect of the show that is Georgia football. They know it. They know exactly what it'll be like. So Georgia likes those type of players because they already know what they're getting. There's track record. There's proven history about, hey, your older brother saw it exactly the way it is. And they can tell you when it's hard and why it's paying off. What do those workouts look like? What is Kirby like after a win? What is Kirby like after a loss? Everybody knows what Kirby's like on the practice field because you can hear it all the way to Hazelhurst. But so I think these guys, Agboko is really big, Brandon, because he's coming off a Clemson official. He was one of the few linemen that went and listened to what Matt Luke had to say and didn't commit to the Tigers right on the spot lately. So this one's big because, Brandon, if Georgia wants to have a top 100 overall offensive line prospect in this class, the most likely guy is Ekene Agboko. He's rated as an interior offensive lineman just because he doesn't have that premium size, because he's only like 6'5" and he's not 6'8". But Georgia, Coach Searles has told Agboko that he's a tackle for Georgia. He could be a right tackle, a left tackle. Obviously, he's got great size, great bend, great athleticism. So that's a name to watch because I think Georgia, let's face it, the best recruiting classes Georgia ever has are built around highly skilled, highly projectable offensive linemen. Agboko is one of those. One name I'll throw in there that I think is really intriguing is Braden Fogel. He's a tight end out of Ohio. Could be very odd, Brandon, if Georgia ends up with two tight ends that are in the middle of Ohio and 15 minutes, 20 minutes away from Ann Arbor. Lincoln Keys is already committed. But Fogel, if you want to talk about where Georgia goes next at tight end after Bowman, obviously there's the Caden Prothro thing, and we'll just park that conversation to the side because that one's very interesting. He's really being recruited by Georgia right now as an athlete, even though Todd Hartley is running the recruitment on the assistant coach side. But Fogel, Brandon, number 9 tight end in the country, 6'4", 230, former basketball player, looks pretty slick on his film. He comes into this weekend after an LSU official visit. Penn State is also in the mix for him, so is Notre Dame. But he has a clear appreciation for what Georgia can do in terms of tight ends. He told me that he relates the way Georgia develops tight ends to the way Ohio State develops wide receivers. That's one I'd watch this weekend.
All right, before I ask you about Justice Fitzpatrick, can you just give me like a quick sort of survey of other names that are coming in here this weekend? Rattle off some of these names and a quick thought or two if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. So this is a weekend we've got finally some commitments. Keelan Jones is coming in. So is Graham Houston. Those guys are 2 commitments from Sprayberry and also Buford, respectively. Getting a little interesting here, Brandon, at receiver. That's why we wrote about Dandridge this week. Brady Marchese, Cartersville High School, one of those really early Georgia finds in Northwest Georgia. They prioritized him early. They secured his commitment early. Well, he just went to see Michigan on an official this past weekend. So that's one of those that Georgia, will they keep to retain him? What's Michigan going to do to pry him away? That's one to watch. Obviously, Spafford is another example, current commitment. There's 2 commitments for Georgia at wide receiver now that you can't really say that those are airtight, anchored down commitments. So Marchese taking another visit is very interesting to watch. What's Georgia going to do there? How they're going to make him feel? Brandon, I would be remiss, and this would be recruiting analyst malpractice, if I didn't bring up this name and end with this name as a hammer. Seven Cloud is back in Athens. Folks, he is a real person. He is represented by Rosenhaus Sports, but you're hearing good things about how Georgia, perhaps some of those dollars that were earmarked for other 5 stars, need to go to a guy that's going to help Georgia immediately as one of the most important members in the class in Seven Cloud.
Yeah, let me just say this real quick as a follow-up to that. It's interesting how this story has kind of changed in a couple of fronts. A, it used to be somewhat humorous because we heard about him, but we never really saw much of him as a football player, and there were these old jokes about, well, does he really even exist? Obviously, since he's kind of returned to the sport in junior college, I think he's become a very impressive defensive line prospect in a lot of folks' eyes. So it's kind of gone from being this sort of mysterious figure that people kind of wonder, well, who is this really, to all of a sudden now the Georgia fans I talk to, this is a defensive line prospect they want to see Georgia get. And when the Drew Rosenhaus thing popped up, I think some people wonder, well, all those years of kind of nurturing this relationship, was that all squandered now by a more transactional conclusion to his recruitment? It seems like thus far that's kind of not the case. I guess there's anything that could change, any opportunity for change, but it sort of seems like the best that I can tell is that Georgia's still as strong in this as ever, right?
Yeah, Brandon. Sources tell me what I'm hearing is not only is Cloud going to be in Athens this weekend for his official, but he's actually snuck up to Athens at least one other time so far during these official visits and these scavenger hunt type seasons to take a good look behind the curtain at Georgia as well. I mean, yes, the Rosenhaus Sports example is an outlier to watch right here. But I'm going to tell you, Brandon, the roots with him in Georgia and his family go back a very long ways. And I'm not just talking about his original commitment to the 2023 class.
All right, so let's try to do 2 things real quick here for a moment. The 2 commits that Georgia got, and we'll try to keep this quick because I want to be respectful of your time. The Justice Fitzpatrick thing I took as great news earlier this week. You love guys from St. Thomas Aquinas. You love guys whose brothers were kind of recent greats in the SEC. Everything to recommend about all that. I will say it kind of caught me off guard a little bit. I don't know that I was expecting this commitment coming off that official visit to unfold the way that it did. Can you give me a thought or two here on Justice Fitzpatrick's commitment to Georgia?
Yeah, so obviously everybody's hit the high note about, hey, Justice is related to Minka. That's his younger brother. Kirby Smart's relationships there. But here's what I like about this. Although he's rated as the nation's number 3 corner, Brandon, I think you could see a projection here of him playing some star eventually. Of course, that's what Minka did for the Tide when he exploded onto the scene. You might see a situation next year. Georgia has Daniel Harris and likely Ellis Robinson doing their thing, maybe at an all-SEC level, and then some at the corners. How do you get Justice, very talented Justice on the field? Maybe you slide him in there at star. Brandon, one thing that we need to underscore and say a lot more going forward, if we haven't already, is very quickly on the slide, 2 things are happening. Dante Williams is notching up wins on the recruiting trail when there was not many of those in his first year at Georgia. And number 2, Brandon, this was a guy that Miami wanted. Miami, and it's millions wanted. And this was a guy that was in the backyard of South Florida as well. But Brandon, I don't know if you caught this. I'm going to give credit to Hayes Fawcett and On3 for their graphic when he made their commitment. But he said he's ready to go to war at the University of Georgia. And when that is a potential future starting member of that Junkyard Dogs defense, you got to like that.
No, I think that's really good. And then, of course, the weekend kind of got started with Carter Lucky's commitment to Georgia. I like guys who know the program. We said this a moment ago with Dean and Ogbogo. You like guys who kind of know they kind of know how to count the cost when it comes to playing in a place like Georgia. Good-looking defensive line prospect, chance to probably gain some weight and be even more effective at the college level. But the sort of players like Carter Lucky are guys you just sort of have to have in your program. You'd assume a good locker room dude, a chance to be a really good player on the field, almost certainly a hard worker. You got to have guys like this on your roster, so I thought that was an important commitment for Georgia too.
Got to make sure we say this about Lucky. You're talking about 5 members of a family, Brandon, across 2 generations that will now put on the red and black. That says a lot. There's his father, his brother, his 2 uncles. There's a chance next year that you would have, goodness, Brandon, so many brother tandems potentially on Georgia's football team now. When you look about, Carter could play with Lawson, potentially Ekene with Nnamdi going forward. And that's something that it just says something about the culture at Georgia and what they try to preach about connection when they've got brothers following brothers, and dads and uncles played there as well. I bet some folks are wondering, does Champ Bailey have any siblings or have any offspring or nephews that are also coming down the pipeline? He's got a son that's coming up in the coming years as well. But these are the stories you like to see, Brandon, because I don't know, to me, in this day and age, they feel a little bit more NIL proof in terms of risk management because they know what's going on. Georgia just offered another player out of Clark Central this week, Anthony London Jr., whose father also played at the University of Georgia years ago. There's already Kedrick Golston, the second as well. So there's a lot of these generational dogs, next generation type guys popping up. So these are good things to see when you look at all these things happening for Georgia right now.
Jeff, great stuff. Hope you have a great weekend. I know the graduation festivities continue for your family, which we're thrilled about. So y'all enjoy that from Miss Hannah, and we will look forward to seeing you back here very soon on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger.
Hey, Brandon, have a great weekend, man. See you later.
You too.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
And to all those who continue to celebrate graduations, or if you're a recent graduate enjoying your summer here, we appreciate you being a part of our program today. And, of course, a great way to celebrate graduations and fun festivities with a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. So, in light of that, let's get ready to go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. I'm ready to graduate myself to my next cruise vacation experience, one unlike any ever before. Cannot wait, hopefully anyway, very soon, if I can figure out a way to make it happen, to be on board Star of the Seas. And, of course, Star of the Seas, like so many of these Royal Caribbean cruise ships, going to be sailing to Perfect Day Coco Cay and a chance to enjoy that thrill water park. They've got their own water park on the ship there as well. Like, one of the things you get with Royal Caribbean is a chance to enjoy all kinds of fun in the water there, and Perfect Day Coco Cay, perfect way to do that. Tallest water slide in North America, but they have also all these like raft slides and things like that. People just love all of that. And of course, if you'd rather be a part of the chill island where it's more relaxed, to be totally honest, that's probably a little bit more my speed. You got a chance to do that there too. Perfect Day Coco Cay, just as good as it gets. Our Jessica Slater can tell you how to get there. She's an expert when it comes to Royal Caribbean cruise vacation, so give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. All right, as we get ready to go cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean right now, I want to circle back to something we talked about earlier today. Brad Crawford, CBS Sports, his list of impactful transfers in the SEC. Now, we've gotten very used to seeing Oklahoma on lists like this. Jay Knott, the running back from Cal, John Mateer, the quarterback from Washington State. They're, of course, both represented here. You're not surprised by that by now. We have said, I'm of the belief that their impact on Oklahoma and the SEC might be overstated. I have my suspicions about how much better Oklahoma can be just on the basis of a couple of transfers, but who knows? I'm wrong frequently. Maybe I'm wrong about that. What's more interesting about a list like this, and this is why, we're in like the summer now. That means next month, essentially speaking, fall camp sort of begins. So we're kind of to the season. It's time to get a lot more specific and a lot more concrete about our predictions for various teams and what we sort of think they can be and kind of why we think that. So what's interesting about a list like this is if you're wondering why you're seeing so much buzz out there for LSU right now, for instance. You got a couple of names that sort of show up on this. A receiver like Nick Anderson, who comes over from Oklahoma. A edge rusher like Patrick Payton, who comes over from Florida State. LSU gets Garrett Nussmeier returning at quarterback, but they have dipped into the portal multiple times for players that could make a big impact there. That's one of the reasons why you're going to kind of see them sort of near that sort of preseason top 10-ish spot, and a team that's going to be getting a lot of preseason playoff love. Part of that is because after really kind of not figuring out the transfer portal a lot in Brian Kelly's first years at LSU, they've been much more aggressive and, in the eyes of most, much more successful here this year. However, let me mention a different name here and a different team here. You've heard me say that when I look at the possibility of turnaround team in the SEC, the team I keep coming back to is Auburn. And it's important to know that I don't know that the migration of Eric Singleton from Georgia Tech, where he was a very good player as a wide receiver, to Auburn, and we're led to believe for a pretty big NIL deal, I don't know that that's gotten enough attention. Because when we think about receivers, it's not so much individual receivers sometimes as it is the receiver group. For instance, at Ohio State, Jeremiah Smith arguably is the best player returning in college football here this year. I would listen to people who want to make that argument. But the thing that's made Ohio State so dangerous is the presence of a guy like Smith along with other NFL talent at the receiver position. Receiver is one of those things where you kind of get done in by the receiving group, your receiving core. And Singleton going to Tech in and of itself may not be a game-changing move. But when you pair him with Cam Coleman, who, for all the attention that Jeremiah Smith gets and Ryan Williams gets, Coleman is among a pair of really good sort of freshman receivers from Auburn a year ago, Coleman the most notable. All of a sudden, you put Singleton with Coleman, the possibility of Jackson Arnold resurrecting his career as maybe the starting quarterback. And that sort of feels like the kind of offense that Hugh Freeze has had success with before. It's one of the reasons why we think that Auburn's a top 25 team. And we think they're going to exceed their season win total. Making a push at 9, if you can get to 9, then the ball bounces the right way, and then maybe you get to 10. That it's at least worth having the discussion if a team like Auburn is a fringe playoff contender, and if the movement of a guy like Singleton from Tech to Auburn could perhaps be one of the reasons why. Let me look at a different SEC team for a moment. I thought we got a recent, very interesting quote from Texas A&M coach Mike Elko. Yesterday we kind of had some fun at Elko's expense. He was the silhouette for our anonymous coach, not the one quoted in these magazines, of course. We just needed somebody to sort of be the anonymous coach. And listen, Elko's about as anonymous as they get. He's trying to change that, though. Doing these sort of rubber chicken kind of booster club type deals, which a lot of coaches, Kirby Smart doesn't do much of this, but a lot of coaches around the country do this. He told a bunch of people in Houston this week that our goal is to build the best program we're capable of being. When we do that, now listen to this. He says, when we do that, it won't matter who we play or who's in the SEC. No one will be able to stop us. I find this to be interesting because, as I've told you, I believe, even though they're not the worst team in the SEC, I believe that Texas A&M fans are the least happy fans in all of the SEC. When it was found out that Texas was coming to the SEC, their hated in-state rival, Aggies fans, Aggie Nation, they were beside themselves. We know this because, it's the worst kept secret in the world. They're the ones that leaked the story that Texas and Oklahoma were coming to the SEC. Everybody seems to believe that. Summer of 2021 at SEC Media Days. So they did not want Texas to come to the SEC. Prior to all of this, the SEC was sort of mostly guided by unanimous decisions. Any kind of movement in the SEC almost any decision was made unanimously. That was just the kind of leadership era that Mike Slive and Roy Kramer before him sort of oversaw. Well, since Texas and Oklahoma have come to the SEC, unanimity is a sort of a bygone concept. This is not a unanimous league anymore. And A&M, stood there and watched Texas join the conference, much to their behest. They hate Texas. And this past year, at least they got the concession of, in the renewal of the rivalry, they got a chance to host the game in Kyle Field. And then they lost. And so now you've got Texas in the conference that they were proud to be a part of. Texas has been in the playoff now 2 years in a row, and Texas beat them head-to-head. You've also seen the A&M baseball coach leave to go to Texas. They've really had disappointing conclusions to every non-football sport, right? I mean, basketball, baseball, softball, I think. They've had very disappointing, non-football seasons based on the expectations that existed there. This is a very unhappy fan base. And so you've got Elko, who I think of as a little bit of a nondescript personality, trying to say, nobody's going to stop us once we get rolling. I don't know if Aggies fans believe that right now. I think they're pretty dejected. And while the overall win total for A&M is pretty high, I think it's 8.5, the analytics that sort of back that kind of tell a positive story. There will be some people that put Texas A&M in their preseason top 25. If somehow that takes a turn for the worse, watch out what happens. I'm just telling you right now, this is an unhappy fan base, and that is a potential greasy rag next to a gas can, next to a box of matches. This thing can get messy in College Station. Watch and see. All right, let me also conclude our cruise on the SEC by mentioning, unfortunately, no Georgia baseball this weekend as you roll towards the Super Regionals. I will give you, though, the series that do involve SEC teams. Auburn set to host Coastal Carolina, which now makes 5 days in a row, I believe. We've mentioned the Chanticleers baseball team here on this show, which is a previously unimaginable set of circumstances. But Auburn set to host Coastal Carolina. LSU, after just barely escaping its own regional, gets ready to host West Virginia. And the big one's going to be Arkansas, Tennessee. Y'all, this is going to be so much fun. Chipper Jones going to hate every second of it because there's going to just be swag left and right in this series. It's going to be, as I said before, SEC plays sort of an unchaperoned brand of baseball. This is going to be that on steroids. Going to be such a fun series. You've got that big battle there. I would put Arkansas as the favorite to win it, despite the fact that Tennessee, the defending champs. You've got a chance that 3 SEC teams make it to Omaha. At least one will because of the head-to-head battle. We'll see kind of what else happens there. After, admittedly, a disappointing regional for the SEC, if they can kind of do something in the Super Regional that makes the College World Series sort of feel like we thought that it would. And for now, we'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And here on DawgNation Daily, we'll also get ready to kind of wrap up our week with a long finish presented by the Finnish Long Drink. We love the Finnish Long Drink going into a great summer weekend. I do want to confess something for a moment. This is sort of breaking the fourth wall, kind of, pulling back the curtain here for a moment. As of yesterday, I had planned something for this segment that I decided not to do. There was to be totally honest, one of the ESPN writers had gone on the Paul Feinbaum show yesterday. I was doing some work, and I had the Feinbaum show in the background, and this guy comes on and said something about Georgia from 2022, and it just crawled all over me. And I was going to come on here and do a big thing about that to kind of close out our week. But then I decided, man, it's a summer Friday. People are in a good mood. Let's don't do something negative to conclude the week. So I decided not to do that. So what I originally planned on doing, we're not going to do. Instead, I'm going to do this. I used to be a big NBA fan. Now I'm really not. I don't watch the games. I did not watch last night's NBA championship game 1. But anytime this happens in sports, I'm always fascinated. Do you know the story here? Indiana, after having kind of a miraculous comeback against the Knicks, I guess, in the Eastern Conference Final, also put together a miraculous comeback. Their winning probability at one point in time was less than 1%, and yet somehow they found a way to charge back, get the win over the Oklahoma City Thunder. But more interesting to me than that, the comeback is interesting, but more interesting to me than that is that coming into the series, Oklahoma City was a giant favorite. You may not realize this because it's a fairly nondescript NBA Finals, but Oklahoma City has won playoffs plus regular season like 80 games this year. It's one of the most successful single seasons in NBA history. They were, if you care about gambling odds, before the series began, something like minus 700 to win the series. And they lost game one. And what's interesting to me about that is that the NBA historically, now we have some counterexamples, for instance, early 2000s when Detroit beat Shaq and Kobe, for instance, but we have some instances of upsets in the NBA Finals, but the NBA is the sport that historically in my lifetime, and for basically everyone's lifetime, has just had fewer upsets than other leagues and other sports. Now, why that is, I don't necessarily pretend to know, but this is the sport which doesn't typically have a lot of upsets, and last night we saw a gigantic one, and it came in comeback fashion. So that sort of got me thinking. This is just something to kind of close the week on. It's a small point. It's not meant to be, a major topic or anything. Our sport, college football, has some degree of upsets all the time. Surprising things can happen in college football. But perhaps the thing that makes them surprising is we don't necessarily see them coming. So this is maybe some homework for the weekend. Ponder this. In college football right now, what would even count as a surprise? Because, the thing about talking season and the fact that our off season is so long, by the time we get to the season, every angle's been explored. Literally every SEC team will be mentioned as a potential surprise team. And then every team up near the top will sort of get the treatment that Georgia seems to get a lot of, which is, are we really sure so-and-so is going to be any good? Like by the time we get to the season, almost every angle will have been explored. Almost any potential talking point will have been talked to death. But last night's NBA Finals Game 1 does remind you, is that very surprising things can happen. So let your mind wander on this for a moment. I don't necessarily have a conclusion for you on this or necessarily a solution to it, but let your mind wander. What is the surprise, the true, unbelievable, unforeseeable surprise we could see in college football this season? For instance, the one thing that almost always happens is a team that's officially ranked in the preseason top 10 will finish unranked. That actually happens a pretty good bit. Last year, we correctly identified the two teams that would be Michigan and Florida State. We said, hey, they're preseason top 10. I could see them both falling on hard times. Florida State was terrible. Michigan was at least dangerous. They beat Ohio State, but certainly a pretty poor follow-up to a national champion. So maybe that even isn't all that surprising because we did predict it to occur. But last night, Indiana proved surprises can happen, even in a sport like the NBA where they don't typically have a lot of those. College football, we're a little more open to that because it's just a sport with a lot more teams. What could the big surprise be? History tells us we may not be able to identify it, but if previous years are our guide, it could be on the way. And that's our long finish presented by the Finnish Long Drink. And we hope you're getting ready to enjoy a wonderful weekend here coming up. And we believe the Finnish Long Drink a great way to go into that weekend. Whether you like the Long Drink Pineapple, the peach-flavored version here in the Peach State, my favorite, the Blue Can, the traditional citrus, the grapefruit flavor, the Gin Kick. My wife loves the Long Drink Cranberry. I can promise you this. I'm hoping to get some pool time here this weekend, and in and around the pool, all over the place. I know because I saw it last weekend. You're going to see the Finnish Long Drink all over the place. People love that, and they love toasting me with it because they know how much I love it too. We love having the Finnish Long Drink as a part of DawgNation Daily, and we're happy to do the long finish with them each and every Friday here on our program. And as we conclude our week, we're going to do so with 3 golden shoes today. It's been a while since we've done multiple golden shoes to close out the week, so let me show some love to some folks here, starting with our first one. Our buddy Richard D sent this in to me via email. I love this graphic. He says, the dog days of summer are long. He says, I can't wait till football season. You see a rendition of, I'm assuming AI assisted here, of the Georgia Bulldogs sweating it out in the summer heat. indeed, like the true heat of the summer hasn't quite gotten here yet, although I think it will be here to a degree today. But that Georgia Bulldog, much like the rest of us, longing for football season. It'll be here before you know it. Really good stuff from Richard Dees. How about another golden shoe going after our buddy Andrew Carraway? Great guy. We talked about my love for college football magazines a little earlier. Andrew showing this photo of his young child saying, getting him started early, tagging me and our guy Rusty Manziel there on that. You love to see the young folks reading the Lindy's magazines. That's just good parenting as far as I'm concerned. We'll give Andrew and his little one a golden shoe for that. That is incredibly fun. And then finally, a golden shoe going out to our guy, the real Georgia on Tap. We had some fun with yesterday with Kirby Smart saying all these people who are saying bad stuff about Gunnar Stockton. He says, oh, I heard you. Kirby saying that to Feinbaum and perhaps saying that to anybody else who would dare try to, go to that low-hanging fruit of, Gunnar Stockton or anything else related to the Georgia Bulldogs. Real Georgia on Tap, apparently paying attention to everybody who might be saying that right now. We'll give him a golden shoe as well. And to close out the week, lousy, stinking Gators. Let's make some fun of them. How about 1,672 days? That's how long it's been since Florida's beaten Georgia. That is our Gator Hater Updater. Y'all have a great weekend. Enjoy it. We'll see you back here Monday. DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. We'll look forward to talking to you then. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust them for all of that. I want to start on Facebook today. We'll see how they are doing. I will tell you that my phone's not working very well in this building here today. So we'll see if this operates as it should. But we'll try to do that. And then we'll get some comments. And then we'll bounce out of here. And then we'll get ready for a weekend. It's my son's last baseball tournament this weekend. So ready to enjoy that. Just getting ready for all kinds of good stuff. My daughter's still rolling right along with her things. But it's funny. It's like, for kids these days, like summer doesn't feel that different than school. It's just they just kind of roll right into the next thing. But we still find time to enjoy stuff and do all kinds of stuff like that. All right, Facebook is loading slowly, so let me let it load. I'm going to get some YouTube comments while I wait. Jonathan Aaron mentioning Baby Gronk. I guess Baby Gronk's getting ready to make another commitment. Yeah, that's a pretty weird situation. Tyrone Brown checking in from Columbus. You love to see that. That's always great to see. Let's see what else. Yeah, this is going pretty slow. G. Grace in here supporting Kalen DeBoer, so there you go on that. And I've said, I don't love this opinion, but it is, I think, my opinion is I'm probably a little higher on Alabama than I would prefer to be prior to the start of the season. Randy Payne says he's playing golf with our buddy Chris. So Chris, one of our great Dog Nation cruisers, Randy, one of our great Dog Nation cruisers. They're going to be playing golf with each other. That's awesome. That's good stuff. Love those guys. So many good people on our Dog Nation cruise. Lewis Sutherland says we need to do a show with Cody. Well, yes, listen, we need to have Cody on as much as we can. Cody's doing a great job. G. Grace says, I think that Indiana is going to put up a good fight, but Oklahoma City is going to win the finals. Yeah, so, listen, if you were looking to bet the series, and I'm guessing a lot of people who put big money on this last night were regretting that decision, perhaps with a good reason, but it's interesting how the price you would pay on Oklahoma City to win it just drops dramatically after the game one loss. And, I can cite examples here of, like, when AI, this is a long time ago, but like AI against Shaq, for instance, Shaq and Kobe, Philly wins game one, gentleman sweep after that. That it seems like we see some rando game ones and then sort of justice is served over the course of the rest of the series. So, if you're interested in betting, and I would advise you to tread lightly into any of that. But if you're interested in betting, I think the price in Oklahoma City is now on sale compared to where it was, and I would not change my mind on them as the likely winner of the series. JC says, why don't we talk about who's on Georgia's roster who can step up as a second-string player and not miss a beat at that position? Well, I would say one of the names that's at least somewhat similar to that, at least in terms of an expanded role, might be a guy like Gabe Harris, who we talked about a little earlier today. That's a guy I would have some belief in, too, that sort of fits into that category. JC also mentioning he was more of a basketball fan in the 80s and 90s than now. Yeah, I would say that's true for me, too. I mean, I used to sort of view, NBA playoffs, things like that, sort of can't miss. I don't quite. I mean, I did not watch last night's game. Don't plan on watching any of the games. Let us see what else. Spencer Clark mentioning A.D. Mitchell and Brock Bowers in the same sentence. Like, the one thing that I'm going to say about A.D., though, I know he leaves, goes elsewhere to finish his college career, and the sort of never-ending debate of who is and isn't a DGD, under full stop, no equivocation, A.D. Mitchell, DGD for life. Go-ahead touchdown in the 2021 National Championship game against Alabama, game-winning touchdown in the comeback win against Ohio State. Some of the biggest moments in Georgia's football history. A.D. Mitchell's got his fingerprints all over him. That is a DGD if there ever was one. Let me see if Facebook is working now. Let's get some Facebook comments when they load. Elite GB says AD is a DGD, no doubt. So there you go on that. Here you go. Barry Watkins says, did you know that Dominique Wilkins lives in Conyers, Georgia? I guess I didn't know exactly where it was that he lived, but I do know that the Wilkins name about to be represented at Georgia basketball. What, next year? I guess he's on his way in. That's a pretty impressive prospect out of Grayson High School. Pretty impressive prospect for sure. Jim Blair says he's getting ready for the Dogs down there in Moultrie, Georgia. Just 90 more days. You love that. Yeah, some good comments kind of rolling in here. Ken Holcomb says, somebody let me know when the Hawks are back in the playoffs. I may watch an NBA game then. Yeah, could be a long time coming. Could be a long time for sure. At least in the actual playoffs, not the play-in stuff. That's kind of the thing now. That's perhaps the case. Let's go to DawgNation.com, see how people are doing there. All right, let's see what else. They are all over the place at DawgNation.com right now. Yeah, they're sort of all over the place over there. It looks like people have mostly just sort of started their weekend. Garrison Tucker mentioning Brian Kelly. I would say that, LSU is among the more interesting teams in the SEC coming into the season, just because they did bring back quarterback. They have been thought to have used the portal well. There's a lot of criticism of Kelly kind of prior to that. Needed defensive lineman, for instance, a year ago, and really didn't get what he needed. Brought in a bunch of guys in the secondary, but it ended up not really being kind of an impact haul. I think that, before you even get into whatever may or may not have happened with Bryce Underwood, I don't know that Kelly has necessarily navigated the new NIL era particularly well, but this is apparently an offseason which that's maybe not the case. It's also probably true they may have the best backup in the SEC and they've kind of had that for a while because you had Nussmeier backing up Jaden Daniels, and now you've got Van Buren, last year starter at Mississippi State, I think the backup for Nussmeier. Pete Williams also agrees that A.D. Mitchell's a DGD. He just left Georgia to be closer to home. Can't blame a kid for wanting to be close to home. Yeah, I mean, I think it's like when you were here, did you make a significant contribution to Georgia? You'd be hard-pressed to make a more significant contribution than that. see what else. Senior Dog 54 asking about Brian Snicker as the Braves manager. I don't think you can fire a guy like this. So, I mean, the Braves have been good for so many years in a row. Within this half decade, they've won the World Series. This may prove to be Snicker's last year. I told our video audience before our show began today that when you lose in back-to-back games and a series sweep, of course, in Arizona, or I should say to Arizona, but kind of like a 2-1 game where you don't do anything offensively, then an 11-10 game where you have a huge lead and just sort of cough it all up. I do sort of wonder if this is the moment in which the season kind of spirals out of control, where instead of sort of scuffling of losing streak, winning streak, losing streak, winning streak, where all of a sudden now it just sort of, you may say, well, you can't get any worse than this, which may be true, but it can certainly stay as bad as this. You kind of wonder if the wheels are just going to come off for Atlanta now and it gets actually really bad for a prolonged period of time. Even if that happens, Snicker's not getting fired in season. They made the in-season move with Tuiasosopo. They're not making an in-season move on Snicker, but it very well could be his last year. UJ Marine asking about Pierce Sperlin, whether or not he's still in school or still around the program. I don't know, other than the fact that he's obviously medically disqualified, going back to a year ago, medical retirement. I don't know if he still goes to school there or not. That's a good question. I'll try to find out. Dave Snow, by the way, good to see Dave in here, says that's always the question going back to AD. Some kids want to be near home. Others want to find their own path, go somewhere different, not be too close to home. I always say stay home because Georgia's going to help you more than when you're done playing. There's definitely kind of I think, to be honest, I think a lot of the SEC teams going to get this right, but obviously we love the way in which Georgia in particular gets this right, of understanding their relationships just last a long time, for years beyond your time being in college. And we think stuff like that really matters. And so that's why we think that when guys choose to come to Georgia, they are choosing, a good decision. So Savannah Bryan says, thanks for the longer show today. Just completed my 750,000th meter milestone on the hydro. That's awesome, man. Brian, that's all. I always feel like when you guys are exercising while you're listening to me in a sort of roundabout way, maybe I'm getting a little exercise too, which I could certainly use more of. So that is really good. The show has been incredibly long lately. We are going to tighten that up as we get closer to the season. Maybe not next week, but as we get closer to the season, we're going to kind of tighten that up. Let's see what else. Johnny Prescott talking about Raisel Iglesias' struggles. Unfortunately, that's the case for him. Garrison Tucker says he thinks the two deepest position groups for Georgia, and I completely agree with this. I believe it's tight end and inside linebacker. I believe that's the case. Ken Holcomb mentioning that Craig Kimbrell is now back with Atlanta. Given the slow rise of Kimbrell up to the major league roster, something tells me this is not going to quite be a game changer. And bullpen plays typically pretty erratic. Some of the most famous baseball bettors, bets are based on models. Models project outcomes. There are some pretty well-known baseball bettors that don't project bullpens. They just put league average bullpens across the board because it's a little bit like, the old meme about college kickers. You could have a good kicker, but he may still miss a field goal because that's what college kickers do. I would say there's a pretty strong correlation, but I would think between the kind of erratic results for college kickers and major league bullpens. That's not meant to excuse make, but you just sort of never know what you're going to get from your bullpen. Let's see what else. Elite GB says he likes the long shows. Well, I appreciate that. Let's see what else. JC says, could you imagine all the bill, what's on the bill for the food all the players eat in college? He says they're not eating soup and ramen noodles. Yeah, I can only imagine what Georgia must spend on food and the specifics of the nutrition. I also think about this sometimes. This is one of the reasons why I don't think that college football, college athletics in general, have done a very good job defending itself against its critics. I think a lot of the people who are in charge are just afraid to. I don't think they like the optics of it, and they're just afraid to defend themselves. But think about this. Like if you took me, for instance, and like put me in a college program, I'm not talking about like the contact on the field. I don't want any part of that. But the life lessons and the nutrition and the weight room and stuff like that, and I couldn't do the same workouts they do. But like if somebody invested that much time in me, like how much would that be worth? Or just any person, me, you, anybody else. Like how much would that be worth? Like, every major corporate executive in every big company, they all have their own coaches. That's a big part of corporate success. These corporate leaders are trained by the kind of business coaches. Think about it kind of a little bit like a life coach. It's just a very common thing. So imagine the sort of life coaching Georgia gives to its players, how expensive, like what the monetary value of that is. They literally give you a plate of food and say, here, eat this, designed specifically for your body composition to either reduce the amount of fat or add, the muscle. And it's perfectly designed for you. All you have to do is just eat what's on your plate and your body just starts to change. It's always amazing to me, just given what the typical high school athlete's diet is. When you see a high school athlete who's already in pretty good shape, I'm always like, what kind of sorcery is this? Because most of these guys are just eating honey buns. Even the good athletes have a tendency to not have very good concepts of nutrition. That changes when you get into college because they're literally putting the plate in front of you and saying, here, eat this. There's no telling how much a program like Georgia spends on that, the actual food itself, and those who prepare it and those who plan the meals. That's a big part of the process too. And it'd be fun to think that somebody might do that for you. It'd make certainly life a lot easier. Let's see what else. Elite GB says most schools are going to cut their budget on food to keep up with the NIL money. Yeah, I would say there are going to be some cuts. I don't know that it's going to be to that. Nutrition and like weight room stuff is still going to be among the most important things. We're already seeing some programs make some cuts. There are a lot of associate ADs who may be, and I don't take any joy in saying that. I hope nobody loses their job. I'm not taking pleasure in saying that, but there have been some staff cuts in some places. A lot of this is going to be kind of determined about the kind of work those people are doing. And I'm guessing on the nutrition side, that's one of those things they're going to look to cut last, and hopefully cut never. Let's see what else. Justin Ham, thank you for the kind words. I appreciate that, Justin, who also says he enjoys the long shows. I appreciate that. I do appreciate that. Let's see what else. Dave Snow says, when I ran a NROTC at the University of Memphis, he says Derrick Rose was a freshman there who went on to do, obviously a great player at Memphis, and then went on to be a MVP level player with the Bulls. He says he would always talk to Derrick Rose, and he was always eating like gummies, like gummy worms, things like that. Yeah, there are a lot. I think Lamar Odom was also famous for that too. His diet essentially consists of candy. I think Odom was the one that was famous there, right? Always just ate candy. Some guys just can. They just can. Garrison Tucker says he had this conversation with some coworkers. Do you believe some of the greatest college ball players of the last few decades could compete against the best players since the mid-2000s? So what I will say about that is that people kind of tune in and they look at these old films, old games when they see them on TV, and they would say the athlete doesn't look the same. And so, therefore, the athlete must not be as good. But if you're going to have the simulation occur where 2000s athletes take on, like, say, 1980s athletes or 1970s athletes or something like that, you got to do something to kind of level the playing field a little bit. You can't just go back and look at athletes of that era and diminish them because they looked different, because sometimes the game looked different, when they didn't have the training and the things like that, the technology that exists right now. And when it comes to weight room and things like that, technology is just wildly different than it used to be. So if you want to say, well, these guys from this era are going to take on the old guys from the old era, but if you're giving these guys the sort of modern technology, yeah, I mean, they would probably win. But if you gave the old athletes the same access to training technology the current guys do have now, well, I'm guessing those athletes would look a lot like these athletes. I'm guessing that's the case. So I think any kind of simulation of that has to take that into account. It's got to take that into account. And that may be a cop-out answer, but I guess what I'm getting to is I don't diminish previous eras because those athletes look different than these athletes. I don't diminish that. I think the incredible feats of bygone era still actually stand up and hold up pretty well, even if the quality of the video or the level of training, things like that, even that was a good bit different. I still think some of those accomplishments still hold up pretty well, even from the times before I was born. For instance, we talk a lot, I think we said this before, Tiger Woods getting near Jack Nicklaus major championship record and then not getting to it actually gave me a fresh new appreciation for how good of a golfer Jack Nicklaus really was. Now, I think there's a lot of that in sports where as so-and-so gets ready to surpass somebody's record, I do think it properly should give you a renewed appreciation or an appropriate appreciation for just how good players from bygone eras really were. Good question, though. All right, final comments. By the way, speaking of exercise, JC says he's trying to during our RS Andrews cool down, trying to cool down. Just got back from the track running he says running a 4.55 in my penny loafers. Of course, I had to take the pennies out of them there. Well, there you go, JC. Good training for you there too. I love to see that. Love to see that. By the way, I miss penny loafers. I like loafers. I want to see I enjoy a good pair of loafers. The trend where, of course, some of this stuff makes me sound old, but the trend where like people wear like tennis shoes with everything now, that is, it's not my preference. I mean, I'm wearing, tennis shoes right now, sneakers right now. But this thing where like people wearing like sneakers with like suits and stuff like that, not a supporter of that. Not a supporter of that. All right. What else before we go? By the way, our buddy, actually, let me not make that comparison. All right, anything else before we go? Barry Watkins says, going back to the Braves, no excuse for giving up 6 runs in the 9th inning. Yeah, it's as bad as it gets. They hadn't done that since, I think, the early 70s. I mean, almost no team's going to do that. Chef Jay Bowen says, could you imagine what Herschel Walker would be able to do with offensive lines today? Yeah, I think that's a great example of that. I do. West GA Dog fan kind of talking about some of the old coaching tactics of bygone eras. And like I would say that some of that was okay and necessary, and sort of some of that went too far. You know what I'm saying? We're talking about this the other day. It's like, I think it's appropriate to have a little bit of a kind of a new school and old school mindset. And I think some of the good, tough, hard coaching that existed in the past, I think a lot of it came from a really good place, and it was a necessary thing, players' lives. I got yelled at a little bit every now and then. And I do remember that. I don't know that it changed me in the moment, but it certainly I think it's kind of shaped a little bit of who I am now. I'm probably better for it. But also some of that was just problematic. It's the same thing about like, not to get on the soapbox, but you know how like one of the things you see, especially on social media a lot, is, I guess technically, I don't think of myself as being a part of a generation, but I am, I guess, Gen X, I guess. And so there are all these memes about like, we grew up drinking from a water hose and we, left the house in the daytime and didn't come back till dark. And like there is a degree to which that is true. I would say that kids of my era were a lot more unsupervised than kids are today. I'd say that's true. But if I'm being honest, I also can think of a lot of kids, a lot of bad stuff happened to them. If I'm being completely honest, that sort of like lack of supervision and, hey, our parents didn't know where we were. We just sort of came home whenever. While the kids were out, sometimes not some so great stuff happens. So like, I feel like there's sort of a mixture of things that is sometimes true. And some of that goes back to the old coaching stuff there as well. Let us see what else. I also think the kind of coaching that most of us do is not like, we're not professional high school coaches, even certainly not professional college coaches. The kind of coaching we would do is really more akin to teaching than coaching. It's not really strategizing as much as it is, or motivating as much as it is teaching the game. And I do think yellers get tuned out, which is not the same thing as saying you can never raise your voice. Sometimes being animated is valuable, but yellers just get tuned out. And so I think that if you want to be a good teacher, I would say limiting your yelling is probably a good way to do that. And for most of us, unless we're truly, listen, this is the summertime. We got a lot of high school coaches who are listening right now that don't get a chance to listen live during the regular time of the year, almost certainly. That if you want to be a good teacher, speaking in the sort of tone that is sort of encourages listening. If I'm yelling at you, it's hard to look me in the eye, because you're getting yelled at. But if you're not really looking me in the eye, you're not really getting everything that I'm saying. So the sort of tone of voice that would allow you to like be comfortable looking me in the eye is the sort of tone of voice that makes you a better teacher. And when you see like stuff on the sidelines now in football, be it high school, college, NFL, whatever else, most of that is not necessarily good coaching. It's sort of a byproduct of the tension that exists in a football game. There's millions of dollars on the line. You lose, you might get fired. It's a little bit like road rage, where if I'm driving, I'm more focused than I am any other time of the day. And if somebody cuts right in front of me, there's that tendency to be like, what are you doing? Which you normally wouldn't do in a normal situation. It's because whether you realize it or not, your focus creates a level of tension that doesn't exist for you in a non-driving situation. Football works the same way. Some of the like the sideline stuff that you see is not necessarily an example of good coaching. It's just a normal human reaction to the level of pressure that exists around a football game. You would see the same thing, for instance, in all kinds of walks of life, various war rooms, things like that. All right, we got to get ready to go. Anything else before we do? Final comment. By the way, Philip Jordan Wells also says the water fountains in schools weren't too much different than hoses. Yeah, I mean, I do remember how the water tasted coming out of the water fountain. And I would say that hose water did sort of taste like the pipe, and that was not good. It's not good. Did not taste good. My memory of the water fountains is it tasted pretty good, especially because you only got 1, 2, 3 to drink it, then you had to leave. It's that 3-second period, the water just tasted so good. And there was always like the kid that got to be the counter for the teacher who like sort of enjoyed being a fascist and just like really holding people to like the 3 seconds. And I don't care what school you went to, you only got 3 seconds for the water. 1, 2, 3, and then you had to go. And if you were really like a rebel, which I kind of wasn't, you would try to like hold that thing down for like an extra half second or something like that. But that's what you got. You get to the water fountain. It's like 1, 2, 3. So yeah, that is the truth. All right, we're going to go. Y'all have a great weekend. Enjoy it. Keep close to Dog Nation recruiting stuff. I'm going to miss Georgia not being in the Super Regional. That would have been fun. I'm going to cringe with whatever happens to the Braves out in San Francisco. But we'll come back and we'll talk on Monday. So, and with each one of these weekends, that just gets us closer and closer and closer to the actual season. So check out RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price. Promise you can trust them on that. It is going to be hot this weekend. That means summer's like really here. So get that air conditioning unit tuned up to factory fresh specs. Find them online, rsandrews.com. And by the way, Philip Jordan Wells says they didn't have water fountain counters. Every school had water fountain counters. When you came back in from recess, you had to have water, but they had the sort of schoolboy patrol or whatever standing there counting you when you were getting your water. That was a big thing. All right, we got to go, though. Check out RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com. Don't let a plumbing emergency ruin your weekend. Then replace your water heater if you need to. And we'll see you back here Monday morning, DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. We'll look forward to talking to you then.